Okay, so this is your host, Abdullah Najjar, and in this episode, I want to focus on giving closure to this podcast that I have hosted for approximately one academic year. It's certainly been an interesting journey so far. I've definitely enjoyed having these conversations with the different guests that I've had on the show. A lot of them have served with the U.S. military. Some have been deployed to the region, Middle East. Others have reported from the region, from some of the most dangerous areas, and had a lot of interesting stories to share. Other guests, as you might have noticed, were involved with the intelligence community. A number of them, actually, that I've hosted on the show, have been involved in some capacity with either the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, or the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. So there's been a lot of interesting, stories and conversations that have been recorded throughout the past academic year as part of the East Wing. So I just want to take this opportunity to first off, thank my wonderful advisor here at the station, Jamie Gilbert, for her encouragement throughout the process of making this podcast happen, and for her trust, obviously, for her trust in me, and for her belief, for believing in me. Actually, these conversations can be truly sensitive. Some things can be quite tricky to perhaps navigate some controversial topics, but I think we did a good job. I also want to thank primarily my guests, really, for showing up to this podcast and for having these conversations with me. I truly value their time and their openness and transparency. And I certainly appreciate their candor, and for recording sometimes more than an hour long worth of a conversation. These things I truly appreciate. The time and the availability of these guests to actually talk to me on the show about their lives and things that they've done, and some of the stories that they've experienced throughout the years, whether it be in the CIA, military, or otherwise. There are a couple of things here that I'd love to maybe highlight to my audience, especially since these, especially since I have not really talked much about myself or even some of the lore behind the guests or my guest stories, right? So I figured maybe I could talk a little bit about my background here, just to highlight who it is who's the person behind the mic, and talk a little bit about some of the things that go on in the background before we press that record button. A few things about about my guests, and obviously a few things about the process, right? So let me start off here by perhaps highlighting a few things about myself that may not have been emphasized throughout the process of making these podcasts. So I grew up in Libya. I lived in that country for approximately 17 years of my life. I taught myself the English language. I was primarily studying in public schools from elementary school all the way up to high school. And it was during that time that the mode of education, or the main language that was used in these schools was actually Arabic. So I didn't really get a chance to learn English through the schools that I attended. So I just taught myself the language. And then after my time in Libya, I was 17. I ended up in Lebanon. I was pursuing my undergrad in that country. A few years went by, spent approximately 4 years in that country, and then after I graduated, I left Lebanon, and I spent approximately a year in Libya. I was doing journalism stuff, and at the same time, I was hosting a podcast, which sort of revolved around similar themes as the ones that we have, discussed in his podcast. And after my time in Libya, I came here to the United States, to North Carolina, to pursue my master's degree. And this is when I decided to sort of relaunch the podcast that I hosted back in Libya and add maybe a sort of a twist to it in a way. But before I actually started hosting this podcast, I was hosting a different podcast that had that it focused on international students and their stories, essentially what brought them to this country and some of the lessons that they have learned throughout their time here. It was during the recording of that podcast that I actually got to meet a lot of interesting folks. One of which became a very, very close friend of mine. Shout out to our good friend Veronica, a student from Germany, who's been quite supportive as well. And so I want to also take this opportunity to thank her. But then I ended up hosting this podcast. I had a very, had a desire to continue doing what I was doing back home in Libya, and I had access to the studio here at NC State. Obviously, with the guidance of our wonderful advisor Jamie, I managed to kickstart it. And it's interesting because I had this sort of idea in mind. I had a name for it, and I didn't have a logo, right? I was brainstorming different titles, different names. I ended up with this one, in the East Wing, right? But I didn't know what sort of logo I should be using or what sort of picture that I should be putting on display to kind of maybe give a feel of what my audience could expect from this podcast. So I remember one day I was in the Library of Congress. This was during my last week in D.C. in the summer of 2024. At the time, I was working with an Arabic news organization called Ash-Sharq, and I was doing an internship with them. And by the time I was almost done with that internship, I made a short trip to the Library of Congress, and I was exploring that library. And then at one point, I ended up in this one spot inside this library that had, it was an office, but with limited access to the public. So the picture that you see of the logo is actually a picture of that office. But the tricky thing was actually capturing that picture. So what I ended up doing was that I grabbed my phone. I loved that office. And at the time, I had no intention of using that image as a logo for my podcast, right? I just loved this office. I wanted to take a picture of it, but there was it was difficult to capture a picture of that because of the limited access that I had to the office. So what I ended up doing was I was leaning to my left, like as if I was trying to go over the barricade. It wasn't a barricade, but it was something that sort of prevented the access. So sort of leaning to my left, trying everything I can to just capture the perfect, what I would consider a perfect image, that is. And I ended up capturing it added a few filters here and there, and I looked at it again, and I realized that this is exactly what I was looking for. This was the picture that I needed, and it is the picture that I am currently using for my podcast. So I go back to state, or I come back to NC State rather. I launch my podcast, and the first conversation I have on the show was with a veteran war journalist who has been to different parts of the world covering different conflicts in some of the most dangerous areas. And I truly, truly enjoyed this conversation I had with Kathy. Her name is Kathy, this war journalist. And Kathy is, again, a very interesting person who is nice enough to accept my invitation to be on my show. And what was interesting about this conversation that a lot of you might not be aware of is that when her and I were recording this podcast, I was shocked to see that her arm was undergoing a certain set of treatment. And what I saw was this sort of mechanical sort of structure that surrounded her arm. And I asked Kathy about that, right? I was curious to know what had happened. And she told me this was her arm was being treated post a bad episode that she encountered with an Afghan fighter who opened fire on her and her friend, shooting Kathy 5 times and ultimately killing Kathy's friend. So this was a very unfortunate story that Kathy and her friend went through. Unfortunately, the friend did not survive, but Kathy was lucky enough to survive and share her story. This was at a time when she was still in Afghanistan and covering some of what was going on over there. So this is just a little bit about my first episode, some of the things that the audience, maybe some of the listeners might not have been aware of. Then if you listen to my second episode, it was with a Air Force veteran who had resigned from the U.S. military in opposition to U.S. support to Israel's war on Gaza. So we had a conversation together, and he was quite an interesting person. He was introduced to me through Josh Paul, and Josh Paul was the first person from the U.S. government to publicly resign after Israel's war in Gaza in opposition to U.S. support. And Josh was someone that I had also interviewed in collaboration with the radio station, but our conversation together is not listed on this podcast, although you can find it at the YouTube channel of WKNC's. In any case, Josh and I had a conversation together on a podcast, and over this past summer, him and I sat down together for some coffee, and it was through him that I got introduced to, or connected rather, to my guest from the Air Force, Riley Livermore. And it was also through Josh that I managed to talk to or host Harrison Mann, a Jewish DIA officer, an officer from the Defense Intelligence Agency, who also resigned in opposition to U.S. support to Israel's war on Gaza. So these 2 episodes were quite interesting, and it was through a conversation with the first guy to publicly resign that I actually managed to gain access to these 2 individuals. And then if you look at my episode with that's titled Shadow Wars and Black Ops. You will find yourself listening to Rick Prado, one of the CIA's well-known officers who had been deployed to a number of places around the world. And Rick and I had a very, very interesting conversation together, and it was one of my favorite conversations on the show. In addition, you can find other episodes where I've had, other conversations with people from the CIA. One of them being Jim Lawler. Our episode together is titled The Traitor's Tale and the Recruitment of Foreign Spies. And Jim has been on my podcast a couple of times, actually. First hosted him when I was in Libya. It was an online conversation. And then over the summer, when I was up in D.C., we got together a couple of times, and we got a chance to record another episode here at NC State. And I got to attend his third book launch, the launch of his third novel in Middleburg, Virginia. That was a very, very interesting event. Another conversation that I really enjoyed was with Angelica Rigozzi. The title of our conversation together is From the USSR to War Journalism. And I came across Angelica's profile on LinkedIn, and I read a few things about her and decided to reach out, and lo and behold, we ended up having a conversation together. And it was certainly overwhelming. There were many stories that were quite sad and very, very heavy. But I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation together. And fun fact, I may or may not have been hungover when I was recording that podcast, although it might be very difficult to notice. I'm just kidding. So there are a number of episodes here that I really enjoyed recording. I might not be able to go over all of them, but I certainly enjoyed the conversations I had. There's one that I would love to emphasize also, which was with which is titled "Being a Female Intelligence Officer and Leaving the Clandestine Service," and it was recorded with Lindsay Morin. Lindsay was just a phenomenal guest, and I really enjoyed the flow of the conversation that her and I had together. And I think she's got some very interesting stories to share, and I truly enjoyed the conversation we had. And I did record another episode with another female CIA officer, Sarah Adams, one of my very good friends, who's been quite supportive throughout my time here at NC State, and this was the second time we recorded a conversation together, and she's just great. Our conversation primarily revolved around Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, and a few other small topics. But I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation together, and I should say that I enjoyed all of these conversations I've had on the show. A lot of them are quite memorable, and some of my favorite are the ones that I've highlighted here. So again, I do want to take the time to thank all of the listeners, and thank you all for your tremendous support. I thoroughly enjoyed this journey of podcasting. I it's sad that I have to give it a level of closure, at least for now, but it's I guess part of the journey at the end. So thank you all for listening. The process from the beginning to the end, the process of making podcasts is really, really enjoyable. I've poured my heart and soul into this, and I thoroughly enjoyed these conversations and the overall journey. So thank you all for listening. I hope you had a great time hearing some of these stories from a variety of guests that I've had on the show. And yeah, I just want to really, really appreciate the support and keep on listening. I'm sure there are some episodes that I've recorded that you may not have had a chance to listen to, so maybe check those out. And thank you for being a loyal member of the audience. Goodbye.